Continuing Dion from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. I think we're at, by the wonderful eagerness of the soldiers and their extraordinary speed, Dion quickly came to the city and entered what is called the Hecatompedon, sending his light armed men at once to charge the enemy, that, seeing them, the Saracens might take courage. In the meantime, he drew up in good order his full armed men and all the citizens that came in and joined him, forming his battalions deep and distributing his officers in many separate commands, that he might be able to attack from many quarters at once, and so be more alarming to the enemy. So, having made his arrangements and offered vows to the entities, when he was seen in the streets advancing at the head of his men to engage the enemy, a confused noise of shouts, congratulations, vows, and prayers was raised by the Saracens, who now called Dion their deliverer and tutelar deity, and his soldiers their friends, brethren, and fellow citizens. Well, if other beings of choice can be treated as divinities, it makes sense that humans know, people that are known to be humans are going to end up along the same, in that same culture. And indeed, at that moment, none seemed to regard themselves or value their safeties, but to be concerned more for Dion's life than for all their own together. As he marched at the head of them to meet the danger, through blood and fire, and over heaps of dead bodies that lay in his way, and indeed, the posture of the enemy was in appearance terrible, for they were flushed and ferocious with victory, and had posted themselves very advantageously along the demolished works, which made access to them very hazardous and difficult. Yet, that which disturbed Dion's soldiers most was the apprehension they were in of the fire, which made their march very troublesome and difficult, for the houses being in flames on all sides, they were met everywhere with the blaze, and treading upon burning ruins, and every minute in danger of being overwhelmed with falling houses. Through clouds of ashes and smoke, they labored hard to keep their order and maintain their ranks. When they came near to the enemy, the approach was so narrow and uneven that but few of them could engage at a time. But at length, with loud cheers and much zeal on the part of the Saracens, encouraging them and joining with them, they beat off Nepsius's men and put them to flight. Most of them escaped into the castle, which was near at hand. All that could not get in were pursued and picked up here and there by the soldiers and put to the sword. The present exigency, however, did not suffer the citizens to take immediate benefit of their victories in such mutual congratulations and embraces as became so great a success, for now all were busy, employed to save what houses were left standing, laboring hard at all night, and scarcely so could master the fire. And I can't think of Hecatompedon. Is it coming with feet, or groups of 10 feet, or something? Because pet is feet. Is it 12? Hecado is 12, so that's not it. Why can't I remember that? The next day, not one of the popular haranguers durst stay in the city, but all of them, knowing their own guilt, by their flight confessed it, and secured their lives. Only Heraclides and Theodates went voluntarily and surrendered themselves to Dion, acknowledging that they had wronged him, and begged he would be kinder to them than they had been just to him, adding how much it would become him who was master of so many excellent accomplishments to moderate his anger and be generously compassionate to ungrateful men who were here before him making their confession that in all the matter of their former enmity and rivalry against him, they were now absolutely overcome by his virtue, though they thus humbly addressed him. His friends advised him not to pardon these turbulent and ill-conditioned men, but to yield them to the desires of his soldiers and utterly root out of the Commonwealth the ambitious affection of popularity, a disease as pestilent and pernicious as the passion for tyranny itself. Dion endeavored to satisfy them, telling them that other generals exercised and trained themselves for the most part in the practices of war and arms, but that he had long studied in the academy how to conquer anger, and not let emulation and envy conquer him, that to do this it is not sufficient that a man be obliging and kind to his friends, and those that have deserved well of him, but rather gentle and ready to forgive in the case of those who do wrong, that he wished to let the world see that he valued not himself so much upon excelling Heraclitus in ability and conduct as he did in outdoing him in justice and clemency. Herein to have the advantage is to excel indeed, whereas the honor of success in war is never entire. Fortune will be sure to dispute it, though no man should pretend to have a claim. What if Heraclitus be perfidious, malicious, and base? Must Dion therefore sully or injure his virtue by passionate concern for it? For, though the laws determine it juster to revenge an injury than to do an injury, yet it is evident that both, in the nature of things, originally proceed from the same deficiency and weakness, the malicious humor of men. Though perverse and refractory, it is not so savage and invincible, but it may be wrought upon kindness and altered by repeated obligations. Dion, making use of these arguments, pardoned and dismissed Heraclitus and Theodotus. And one of the things that we run into is that that's why we need, we need exacting punishments by the state. Deterring punishments by the state it's going to result in vigilante killings or attacks or whatever. And now, resolving to repair the blockade about the castle, he commanded all the Saracens to cut each man a stake and bring it to the works, and then, dismissing them to refresh themselves and take their rest, he employed his own men all night, and by morning had finished his line of palisade, so that both the enemy and the citizens wondered, when they returned to see the work so far advanced in so short a time, burying therefore the dead and redeeming the prisoners, who were near 2,000, he called a public assembly, where Heraclitus made a motion that Dion should be declared general, with full powers at land and sea. The better citizens approved well of it, and called on the people to vote it so, but the mob of sailors and handicraftsmen would not yield that Heraclitus should lose his command of the navy, believing him, if otherwise an ill man, at any rate to be more citizen-like than Dion, and readier to comply with the people. Dion therefore submitted to them in this, and consented Heraclitus should continue admiral. But when they began to press the object of the redistribution of lands and houses, he not only opposed it, but repealed all the votes they had formerly made upon that account, which sensibly vexed them. Heraclitus, therefore, took a new advantage of him, and being at Messina, harangued the soldiers and ships' crews that sailed with him, accusing Dion that he had a design to make himself absolute, and yet at the same time he held private correspondence for a treaty with Dionysius by means of Pharax the Spartan, which, when the noble citizens of Syracuse had intimations of, there arose a sedition in the army, and the city was in great distress and want of provisions, and Dion now knew not what course to take, being also blamed by all his friends for having thus fortified against himself such a perverse and jealous and utterly corrupted man as Heraclitus was. Pharax at this time lay encamped at Neapolis in the territory of Agrigentum. Dion therefore led out the Syracusans, but with an intent not to engage himself till he saw a fit opportunity. But Heraclitus and his seamen exclaimed against him that he had delayed fighting on purpose, that he might the longer continue his command, so that, much against his will, he was forced to an engagement and was beaten, his loss, however, being inconsiderable, and that occasioned chiefly by the dissension that was in the army. He rallied his men, and, having put them in good order, and encouraged them to redeem their credit, resolved upon a second battle. But in the evening he received advice that Heraclitus, with his fleet, was on his way to Syracuse with the purpose to possess himself of the city, and to keep him and his army out. Instantly, therefore, taking with him some of the strongest and most active of his men, he rode off in the dark, and about 9 the next morning was at the gates, having ridden 700 furlongs that night. Heraclitus, though he strove to make all the speed he could, yet, coming too late, tacked and stood out again to sea, and being unresolved what course to steer, accidentally he met Gasilas the Spartan, who told him he was come from Lacedaemon to head the Sicilians, as Gylippus had formerly done. Heraclitus was only too glad to get hold of him, and fastening him, as it might be, a sort of amulet to himself, he showed him to the confederates, and sent a herald to Syracuse to summon them to accept the Spartan general. Dion returned answer that they had generals enough, and if they wanted a Spartan to command them, he could supply that office, being himself a citizen of Sparta. When Gasilas saw this, he gave up all pretensions and sailed in to Dion, and reconciled Heraclitus to him, making Heraclitus swear the most solemn oaths to perform what he engaged. Gasilas himself also undertaking to maintain Dion's right and inflict chastisement on Heraclitus if he broke his faith. The Syracusans then laid up their navy, which was at present a great charge and of little use to them, but an occasion of differences and dissensions among the generals, and pressed on the siege, finishing the wall of blockade with which they invested the castle. The besieged, seeing no hope of succor, and their provisions failing, began to mutiny, so that the son of Dionysius, in despair of holding out longer for his father, capitulated and articled with Dion to deliver up the castle, with all the garrison soldiers and ammunition. And so, taking his mother and sisters, and manning 5 galleys, he set out to go to his father. Dion seeing him safely out, and scarce a man in all the city not being there to behold the sight, as indeed they called even on those that were not present, out of pity, and that they could not be there to see this happy day and the sun shining on a free Syracuse. And as this expedition of Dionysius is even now always cited as one of the greatest and most remarkable examples of fortune's vicissitudes, how extraordinary may we imagine their joy to have been, and how entire their satisfaction, who had totally subverted the most potent tyranny that ever was, by very slight and inconsiderable means. Well, nowadays the real tyranny is actually to some degree hidden, because like people say, well, okay, Stalin was more objectively destructive and murderous and controlling than even Hitler, but they were both made possible by the same group of people financing them, and the same, well, some different movements, but so the bigger tyranny would be the the financiers behind the whole thing on both sides, and it continues to be that, and it was that a couple hundred years before that, and well, some wars, but yeah. When Apollocrates was gone, and Dion coming to take possession of the castle, the women could not stay while he made his entry, but ran to meet him at the gate. And a lot of who is the bigger tyrant or more totalitarian or whatever, it just depends on who's saying it and what information they have too. But Aristomacha led Dion's son, and Areta followed after, weeping, fearful, and dubious how to salute or address her husband after living with another man. And of course, if you look at that period of time, there was a really ancient Bactrian king that could have beat that, and there was also multiple Chinese rulers that you could have put in with that. Dion first embraced his sister, then his son, when Aristomacha bring Areta to him. "O Dion," said she, "your banishment made us all equally miserable. Your return and victory has cancelled all sorrows, excepting this poor sufferer's, whom I, unhappy, was compelled to be another's, while you were yet alive. Fortune has now given you the sole disposal of us. How will you determine concerning her hard fate? In what relation must she salute you, as her uncle or as her husband?" This speech of Aristomacha's brought tears from Dion, who, with greater affection, embraced his wife, gave her his son, and desired her to retire to his own house, where he continued to reside when he had delivered up the castle to the Saracens. For though all things now succeeded to his wish, yet he desired not to enjoy any present advantage of his good fortune except to gratify his friends, reward his allies, and bestow upon his companions of former times in Athens, and the soldiers that had served him, some special mark of kindness and honor, striving herein to outdo his very means in generosity. As for himself, he was content with a very frugal and moderate competency, and was indeed the wonder of all men that when not only Sicily and Carthage, but all Greece, looked to him as in the height of prosperity, and no man living greater than he, no general more renowned for valor and success, yet in his guard, his attendants, his table, he seemed as if he rather commoned with Plato in the academy than lived among hired captains and paid soldiers, whose solace of their toils and dangers is to eat and drink their fill and enjoy themselves plentifully each day. Plato indeed wrote to him that the eyes of all the world were now upon him, but it is evident that he himself had fixed his eye upon one place in one city, the academy, and considered that the spectators and judges there regarded not great actions, courage, or fortune, but watched to see how temperately and wise he could use his prosperity, and how evenly he could behave himself in the high condition he was now in. Neither did he remit anything of his wonted stateliness in conversation or serious charge to the people. He made it rather a point to maintain it, notwithstanding that a little condescension and obliging civility were very necessary for his present affairs, and Plato, as we said before, rebuked him and wrote to tell him that self-will keeps house with solitude, but certainly his natural temperament was one that could not bend to complaisance, and besides he wished to work the Syracusans back the other way, out of their present excess of license and caprice. Heraclides began again to set up against him, and being invited by Dion to make one of the council, refused to come, saying he would give his opinion as a private citizen in the public assembly. Next, he complained of Dion because he had not demolished the citadel, and because he had hindered the people from throwing down Dionysius' tomb, and doing despite to the dead. Moreover, he accused him for sending to Corinth for counselors and assistants in the government, thereby neglecting and slighting his fellow citizens. And indeed he had sent messages for some Corinthians to come to him, hoping by their means and presence the better to settle that constitution he intended, for he designed to suppress the unlimited democratic government, which indeed is not a government, but as Plato calls it, a marketplace of governments, and to introduce and establish a mixed polity. Well, if it's unrestrained democracy, then you have just what's popular, and you can have a tyranny as a result of that too. A greater tyranny, because whatever is a minority thing, they just, if the majority decides to oppress all minorities, they can do it. But then you end up with too many minorities, and but on a Spartan and Cretan model between a commonwealth and a monarchy, wherein an aristocratic body should preside. That's not the answer to it too. It's a constitution or something like that is actually where to temper a democracy and determine all matters of greatest consequence, for he saw also that the Corinthians were chiefly governed by something like an oligarchy, and the people but little concerned in public business. And let's be honest, that's really what we have in our constitutional republic. Well, I mean, I'm presuming most viewers are American. We've never been a democracy here. We say it a lot, but we've never been a democracy. You read the Federalist Papers or the Constitution or something, it's never been set up as a democracy. Now knowing that Heraclitus would be his most considerable adversary, and that in all ways he was a turbulent, fickle, fictitious man, he gave way to some whom formerly he hindered when they designed to kill him, who, breaking in, murdered Heraclitus in his own house. His death was much resented by the citizens. Nevertheless, when Dion made him a splendid funeral, followed the dead body with all his soldiers, and then addressed them, they understood that it would have been impossible to have kept the city quiet as long as Dion and Heraclitus were competitors in the government. Dion had a friend called Chrypis, an Athenian, who Plato says first made acquaintance and afterwards obtained familiarity with him, not from any connection with his philosophic studies, but on occasion afforded by the celebration of the mysteries, and in the way of ordinary society. This man went with him in all his military service, and was in great honor and esteem, being the first of his friends who marched by his side into Syracuse, wearing a garland upon his head, having behaved himself very well in all the battles, and made himself remarkable for his gallantry. He, finding that Dion's principal and most considerable friends were cut off in the war, Heraclitus now dead, and the people without a leader, and that the soldiers had a great kindness for him, like a perfidious and wicked villain, in hopes to get the chief command of Sicula as a reward for the ruin of his friend and benefactor, and as some say, being also bribed by the enemy with 20 talents to destroy Dion, invade and engage several of the soldiers in a conspiracy against him, taking his cunning and wicked occasion for his plot. He daily informed Dion of what he heard or what he feigned the soldiers said against him, whereby he gained that credit and confidence that he was allowed by Dion to consort privately with whom he would, and talk freely against him in any company, that he might discover who were his secret and fictitious maligners. By this means, Chrypis, in a short time, got together a cabal of all the seditious malcontents in the city, and if any one who would be drawn in advised Dion that he was tampered with, he was not troubled or concerned at it, believing Chrypis did it in compliance with his directions. While this conspiracy was afoot, A strange and dreadful apparition was seen by Dion as he sat one evening in a gallery in his house, alone and thoughtful. Hearing a sudden noise, he turned about and saw at the end of the colonnade, by clear daylight, a tall woman, in her countenance and garb like one of the tragical Furies, with a broom in her hand, sweeping the floor. Being amazed and extremely affrighted, he sent for some of his friends and told them what he had seen, entreating them to stay with him and keep him company all night. Well, some of the entities that one may encounter, yeah, sure, they're shocking, right? But unless it's "Begone, foul temptress" or whatever, just be chill about it and observe what's going on with it. For he was excessively discomposed and alarmed, fearing that if he were left alone the spectre would again appear to him. He saw it no more, but a few days after, his only son, being almost grown up to man's estate upon some displeasure and pet he had taken upon a childish and frivolous occasion, threw himself headlong from the top of the house and broke his neck. While Dion was under this affliction, Cleipus drove on his conspiracy and spread a rumor among the Syracusans that Dion, being now childless, was resolved to send for Dionysius's son Apollocritus, who was his wife's nephew and sister's grandson, and make him his heir and successor. By this time, Dion and his wife and sister began to suspect what was doing, and from all hands information came to them of the plot. Now, if we go back to the person jumping off the roof, the entity could have just been telling him, "Hey, I'm sweeping something. There's something you need to clear out." But he didn't stick around to listen to what may have come next, right? Dion being troubled, it is probable, for Heraclitus's murder, which was like to be a blot and stain upon his life and actions, its continual weariness and vexation. He had rather die 1,000 times and open his breast himself to the assassin than live not only in fear of his enemies but in suspicion of his friends. But Cleipus, seeing the woman very inquisitive to search to the bottom of the business, took alarm. Seeing the women very inquisitive to search to the bottom of the business, because it doesn't matter whether it's a group of people or not, took alarm and came to them, utterly denying it with tears in his eyes, and offering to give them whatsoever assurances of his fidelity they desired. They required that he should take the great oath, which was after this manner. The juror went into the sanctuary of Charis and Proserpine, where, after the performance of some ceremonies, he was clad in the purple vestment of the female entity, and holding a lighted torch in his hand, took his oath. Cleipus did as they required, and forswore the fact, and indeed he so little valued the female entity that he stayed but till the very festival of Proserpine, by whom he had sworn, and on that very day committed his intended murder, as truly he might well enough disregard the day, since he must at any other time as impiously offend her, when he, who had acted as her initiating priest, should shed blood of her worshipper. There were a great many in the conspiracy, as Dion was at home with several of his friends in a room with tables for entertainment in it. Some of the conspirators beset the house around, others secured the doors and windows. The actual intended murderers were some Sacunthians who went inside in their underdresses without swords. Those outside shut the doors upon them and kept them fast. The murderers fell on Dion, endeavoring to stifle and crush them. Then, finding they were doing nothing, they called for a sword, but none durst open the door. there were a great many within with Dion, but everyone was for securing himself, supposing that uh, by letting him lose his life, he should save his own, and therefore no man ventured to assist him. When they had waited a good while, at length Lacan the Saracen reached a short sword in at the window to one of the Sacunthians, and thus, like a victim at a sacrifice, this long time in their power, and trembling for the blow, they killed him. His sister and wife, big with child, they hurried to the prison, who, poor lady, in her unfortunate condition, was there brought to bed of a son, brought to the bed of a son, which, by the consent of the keepers, they intended to bring up, the rather because Calippus began to already be embroiled in troubles. After the murder of Dion, he was in great glory, and had the sole government of Syracuse in his hands, and to that effect wrote to Athens, a place which, next the immortal entities, well, the jinn have respite, so in a way they're sort of immortal. The demons, the daemons, being guilty of such an abominable crime, he ought to have regarded with shame and fear. But true it is what is said of that city, that the good men she breeds are the most excellent, and the bad the most notorious, as their country also produces the most delicious honey and the most deadly hemlock. Calippus, however, did not long continue to scandalize fortune and upbraid the entities with his prosperity, as though they connived at and bore with the wretched man, while he purchased riches and power by heinous impieties, but quickly received the punishment he deserved for going to take Catana Hilas Circus, whereupon they report he said he had lost a city and got a bauble. Then, attempting Messina, he had most of his men cut off, and among the rest, Dion's murderers, when no city in Sicila would admit him, but all hated and abhorred him. He went into Italy and took Rhegium, and there being in distress and not able to maintain his soldiers, he was killed by Leptines and Palispercon, and, as fortune would have it, with the same sword by which Dion was murdered, which was known by the size being but short as the Spartan swords, and the workmanship of it very curious and artificial. Thus Calippus received the reward of his villainies when Aristomacha and Arete were released out of prison. Hicetas, one of Dion's friends, took them to his house, and seemed to intend to entertain them well, and like a faithful friend, afterwards being persuaded by Dion's enemies, he provided a ship and pretended to send them into Peloponnesus, but commanded the sailors, when they came out to sea, and kill them and throw them overboard. Others say that they and the little boy were thrown alive into the sea. This man also escaped, not the due recompense of his wickedness, for he was taken by Timalion and put to death, and the Syracusans, to revenge Dion, slew his 2 daughters. Of all which I have given a more particular account of the life of Timalion. Now, we can't exactly moralize karma or cause and effect and what happens and quite in that way, but certain things have their effect. Oh, you're involved in plots to kill and everything else to gain power, and fire and blood in the pile of bodies, and well, some of that's bound to come against you. The more enemies and all the rest of it, and you play games with, well, what type of government will be most advantageous to me, and